Welcome to the Exploring Unschooling podcast. I'm Pamela Riccia, unschooling mom and author, bringing you interviews, information, and inspiration about unschooling and living joyfully with your family. You can find the episode show notes, your free Exploring Unschooling ebook, and lots more information at livingjoyfully.ca. And here's the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Riccia, and this is episode number 29 of the podcast. It's the 19th of July, 2016, as I record this intro. In this episode, I chat with Meredith Novak about what learning looks like with unschooling. It's a long and wonderful conversation, so I'm going to make the intro short this week. Life around here has been pretty low-key. I've caught up with posting to my Being 50 project on Instagram. We're settling into Michael's work schedule, and our house painting is fitting in here and there with our time and with the weather. It's been pretty nice. Meredith shared so many great tidbits this week that I thought I'd pull one of them out for the quote. She said, "It could be said that unschooling has a recipe, but it's not a recipe about unschooling. It's a recipe about human nature, about people and relationships." I just loved how clearly Meredith articulated this insight. Unschooling isn't about overlaying a learning structure on top of children. It's about understanding how humans learn and exploring how to support that. I think you'll enjoy how she explains the recipe in more detail. So without further ado, on to the interview. Hi everyone, I'm Pamela Riccia from livingjoyfully.ca, and today I'm here with Meredith Novak. Hi Meredith.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. It's so great to have you on the show. Meredith has been active online in unschooling groups for many, many years. I have always enjoyed her writing, and I'm very excited to speak with her today, and we're going to dig into what learning looks like with unschooling. So to get us started, Meredith, can you share with us a bit about you and your family and how you came to unschooling?
Yeah, I've always been really interested in the mind, how the mind works, everything really to do with the mind. So psychology, neuroscience, chemistry, also things like meditation, philosophy, feminism, just anything to do with how and why people think and learn in the world. I'm just into all of that. And for a while, I sort of lived communally with a bunch of other people here in the hills of Tennessee. And in the process, I sort of blundered into unschooling unintentionally, at least at first. Yeah. Yeah, I was one of these people who always wanted to unschool. No. No. My stepson's biological parents, so my partner and his ex, wanted to homeschool. And I was like, okay, that's a little crazy, but all right, I'm on board. And so I ended up involved in that. And over the course of that, we sort of, like I said, blundered our way towards unschooling. And at first it was really more in terms of the parenting end of things. Conventional parenting really, really didn't work well with Ray. He was kind of intense. And it turned out that the more we treated him kindly and were more proactive and thoughtful and listened to what he had to say, the less over-the-top intense he was. So that kind of drew us closer to unschooling. And eventually we started, the homeschooling started moving to more eclectic and more interest-based. And we were right on the verge of going to full-on academic unschooling too, and then custody things happened, and Ray went to school as the way, and it was just kind of, I don't know, it was a bad time, and around the same time, I also had my daughter, and so I thought, well, I'm going to start things a little differently this time, and so I started learning about unschooling online, and so she got to unschool basically from the start, whatever that means, and eventually, Ray got to come home and unschool too when he was 13. So the kids are 8 years apart, and Ray was homeschooled, kind of sort of unschooled, and then in school, and then finally unschooled. And Morgan was just unschooled all the way. So
that's a really interesting story. Yeah. You got to see
strange journey.
Yeah. I was going to say you got to see so much. You got to see the relationship within so many different contexts with that journey, didn't you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Well, to dig into learning, I wanted to start with when I was thinking about how I wanted to frame this episode, when I thought about it, the majority of the unschooling parents who are listening to the podcast, and me included, can't come from a school background. So when we get started, that's what learning looks like to us, right? That is learning. So I thought what would be helpful would be for us to compare and contrast what learning looks like in school and what it looks like with unschooling. Okay, so I came up with 5 aspects to compare that I hope will be helpful, and then I have a few more questions to go on after that. So comparison number 1, let's look at schools' focus on teaching versus unschooling's focus on the learning. Because one of the first things people new to unschooling are encouraged to do is to shift their perspective from teaching to learning. Now, why is this such an important shift when we want to learn more about unschooling?
From my perspective, so much of the way the parent-child relationship is framed out in the culture is really about teaching. It's about what we want our kids to know and who we want them, not necessarily what we want them to grow up to be, but who we want them to grow up to be. And that was something that really surprised me, even about myself, when I started actively thinking about unschooling and thinking it, because I had all these ideas about parenting that turned out to be a lot more about me than about my kids, and that really disturbed me, because I'd always thought of myself as someone who respected kids as people, and then I dig into it and I'm like, oh, this is about me? Wait, I thought I was that.
I'm like nodding my head here. Yeah.
It was like all the emotional energy I had invested in just this idea of myself as a mom really involved this fantasy of who my kids were and could become, and that was a problem, especially was with Ray, because he had definite ideas about who he was, and it wasn't necessarily the person in all of our heads. And Morgan, even when she was a little baby, was very much her own person. I mean, she started breaking baby rules right from the start. She was one of those babies who didn't make eye contact, didn't necessarily want to be picked up when she was crying. So we had to learn a whole new set of ways to get along with Morgan. And then with Ray, especially because he was so intense, this was before we really knew anything about unschooling. We had all these rules and expectations, all the usual parenting rules and expectations, that they were all about, making him the best version of himself that we could imagine. And that didn't really help him all that much. And so the further we got away from that, and the more all of us, but especially I, worked on seeing him for himself and, who he wanted to be and what he wanted to learn, the better things got just across the board.
I know it's such a huge difference, because, when you think about the school system itself, its whole goal is to make one generic kind of, graduate, right? That knows this set of facts, has this set of skills, and they graduate and, kind of guarantee that's what, or at least, that's what they're focusing on, trying to create that ideal graduating student.
And even homeschooling, and sometimes especially homeschooling, it isn't so much about, making the generic graduate, but making the super kid.
Super cool, yeah.
We all want that kid that has the articles about him,
Yeah.
And sailing around the world and keeps their room clean. Yeah.
Exactly. And as soon as you have those goals for think of it, for somebody else, whether it's child or adult, but definitely children, because we think we have more control over them, right?
Yeah.
That's when you focus on the teaching, because I know what you should know. I have these expectations you were talking about. And so everything that whenever you look at that child, you just see the missing pieces and what you think you need to teach to fix them, right?
Right.
Right. It makes a huge difference.
I'm so grateful to Ray and Morgan, is that neither one of them really let me get away with that. They were not going to be molded into anything else.
Well, I know I same thing for me with Joseph. It was because that wasn't, working in quotes, that I started looking for other options, right? I mean, that's a good thing that we could see them and see them, being the person they are and not putting up with what we were trying to make them into. So it's good that, I guess that we could step back and say, hey, maybe I'm part of the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. As difficult as it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, comparison number 2. Schools focus on curriculum and unschooling focuses on curiosity. So with unschooling, children are definitely encouraged to and actively supported by us as they follow their interests rather than a set curriculum. What advantages have you seen to learning this way?
Well, it's really amazing how much richer their learning experience actually is. I mean, especially since, we did homeschool. And worked really hard at it. I mean, even the best, most well thought out, integrated curriculum is still limited by the fact that it's something that's imposed on another person from the outside. I think you just said that. In the schools, you see that all the time in the whole, is this going to be on the test phenomenon. Homeschool parents don't always have to deal with that, but especially work really hard on the curriculum and lesson plans, you always get these great ideas that are going to work. They're just going to work so well, and your kids are going to love it. And you get halfway into it, and they're like, "Are we done yet? Can I go play now?" And you realize, okay. All that work, huh? And even when you get something that does light kids up, it still limits the directions they end up going. And natural curiosity doesn't have those limits. And I didn't realize how much even good education had those limits until I got to see kids really unschooling and just going where their curiosity led them. It just goes in wild, unanticipated directions.
That is so fast. That's one of the pieces that I just love so much and it goes back to when you said, in school, your question is always what's going to be on the test, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember that from, I did well in high school and university, but that was entirely always the focus. I'm just going to learn what I need to know to do well on the test. So even if I loved, say, chemistry or something, I wasn't exploring it. I was just saying, I don't mind going to chemistry class and what's on the test. Right? And then you see your kids pursuing an interest and it's like, holy crap, the determination, all the different places they go. And there is none of that, other than, am I interested? And when they catch something they are interested in, it's just crazy all the places they go, isn't it?
Yeah, and how hard they'll work on something that from the outside it's like, it might seem small, but they're putting all this effort into it. And I know when I was homeschooling, I'd love the kid who would put that much effort into, something. And it just wasn't homeschool.
Yeah, it just wasn't that stuff. And then you also notice that you remember all the things that, we learn in school, and so many times we're told, you'll need to know that someday. Yes, you need to. Why do I gonna ever need to know this? And I know I've forgotten so much yet with my kids, because so much of what they're learning, they're interested in. And because they're interested in it, they're doing it and thinking about it day after day after day. It just seems that they remember a much higher percentage of all the things they figure out along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to watch them. And I think, that's one of the places I picked up a lot of my understanding of learning, was just watching them in action when they didn't have all those expectations and curriculum narrowing down what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. About this time, usually in conversations, one of the concerns that people often mention is that there's a general set of knowledge and skills that are needed to get along in our community or in our world. And how are they going to learn those things if they're just doing what they want? So how do you answer that question?
Well, it's interesting because this is an idea that actually goes right back to I don't know, the roots of education itself. I've just been reading Montaigne's essay on the education of children, which was written in 1580. Okay, I mean this is not an educational theory, but he starts out with some of the same complaints that people make about education today. It's like, these kids are memorizing stuff and then not using it. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, when was this written? 15 what? And then he goes on and he's quoting people like Aristotle. Right, so these are questions, issues that go way back. That first of all, there is this body of knowledge, and that maybe it doesn't do you all that much good to just memorize it. Socrates is, kind of the foundation of, in some ways, of education and knowledge and thinking about thinking. I mean, that's his whole shtick, was like, okay, forget what you learned, walk around town and talk to a bunch of strangers and discover what they know, and the whole world looks very different. So the more interesting question to me is why do we cling to this idea that there's this general body of knowledge that we have to know? And I think the main reason as parents is that we think it's safe. As long as we're staying within the bounds of these things that kids are supposed to know, we can't be accused of doing our kids a disservice. Right? Even if we fail, we've at least followed the rules. Mm-hmm. And stepping out of that feels risky. It is risky. And at the same time, it's why unschooling can be so attractive to parents of kids who've had a rough time in school or homeschooling. We've seen how sticking within the bounds, sticking with the system, trying to focus on this general body of knowledge, how that can fail too and fail spectacularly. Mm-hmm. So when kids are following their natural curiosity, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, that's okay. You keep going.
I got distracted.
Me too. I'm still thinking about Socrates, and I just love the fact that, these are human questions that have been around for so long.
We really want there to be this general body of knowledge. We want there to be something that's like easy and convenient. And we know
it's like we don't want to take it. I mean, it's scary to take the responsibility for it, right?
Yeah, and you step back from issues of like school or homeschooling, and parents are just talking. I mean, everybody really knows that this block of knowledge isn't working, and never really has. But what are you going to do? And my answer is unschooling. And the crazy thing about unschooling is here they are following their little rabbit trails of curiosity, and they manage to pick up a lot of this basic set of skills and information. They pick up the 3 R's. They pick up basic cultural information. They become culturally literate. They learn things about history. They learn things about science. Unschooling kids, I mean, as we know, they get into college, they get jobs. It's not that they're missing out. They're just getting there by a really, really different route.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point is that, that body of knowledge or skills is not the curriculum in school. It's the stuff that they need to interact in their culture and in their community. And they're picking that up through unschooling because they are already interacting with their community, right? And just picking up the things that help them do that better along the way.
They can't help it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a much better, description of that cultural knowledge and cultural skills, like you said, like reading and, basic, numeracy and that kind of stuff. They're the stuff they need to get along in the world, they're gonna pick up because they're already getting along in the world with you by their side and helping them figure it out.
Yeah, and a lot of times what they're getting is more, parents complain and teachers complain and employers complain that these kids today have no real world knowledge. When Ray left school at 13, he hated math, for instance, with a passion. But now he's 22, he'll be 23 in a couple months. And he does carpentry, he does metal work, he's helped build houses, he's building a couple right now. He does a lot of real world math, most of which he didn't learn in school. You don't learn to read a tape measure in school. You pull a kid out of school, even a kid who's good at math, good at fractions, and say, okay, what's 1 3/5 plus 1 1/2, and they've got to stop and do some harder math. Somebody who's used to doing a tape measure can go 1 3/8 and 1 1/2 is 2 7/8. And they know it because they know the tape measure.
Yep.
They're not having to stop and convert the fractions. It's just part of the real world math.
Yeah, well, that was a big piece for me, knowing, seeing for myself the discrepancy between, the stuff I could do in the classroom and being able to apply it out in the world. There was a big discrepancy there. It's, so that was part of my figuring out learning and what's valuable about learning was just looking at myself and that issue. Okay, comparison number 3, schools focus on the compulsory school years versus unschooling's focus on lifelong learning. So unschooling and the concept of lifelong learning really weave together tightly. And one of the things we leave behind us is the idea that childhood is for learning and adulthood is for living. And this can have a really profound impact on everyone in an unschooling family, like me, parents included, that it was a huge piece for me. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, I've always been interested in adult learning, lifelong learning. So the part that's been really profound for me has been the idea that this very messy, convoluted, interactive way that adults explore the world actually works for kids too, even though their brains aren't adult brains. And I think that the difference in brains is kind of a sticking point for a lot of parents. I know it was a big difference for me because I had all this, background in neuroscience and psychology and chemistry and, the brains are different. We can't treat them like adults. And worse than can't treat them like adults, you can't treat them like, normal people. They're kids,
Yeah.
And you see articles like that a lot lately. There's been a lot of focus on how the neuroscience means, you can't be nice to your kids. It's your teenager's brain chemistry makes them demented, so you have to really crack it down.
I know. I've seen those all around.
One of the really fascinating things about radical unschooling in particular is how it manages to integrate the very real effects of human development with the equally real social and motivational factors that make up a big part of arcs. And learning about that has really affected the way I see my own learning process, and it's made me a better learner. Thinking about the ways that human beings are social, for instance, and how we learn from social situations and about social situations has made it easier for me to learn from other people, because that was something I really didn't learn in school. I mean, I left school with, the social skills of a carrot. I was one of those shy kids who didn't talk to people. And learning about unschooling and learning about the way kids learn, it was just really startling to me on that level. It's like, oh, wait, I do that too. Watch people and learn from them. And school is like, keep your eyes to yourself.
Yeah.
Don't share information. That's cheating.
I think one of the things too that can stop people up when we start talking about the social aspect is they go, my child, doesn't want to go out, doesn't want to, doesn't like groups and that kind of stuff. But that social engagement with the activity and with the people around them, it doesn't have to be, strangers. It doesn't have to be other kids. You as a parent are right there, right? So much of that, social processing, working together, you have that right in the home, right?
Yes. Yeah, and my kids are like night and day when it comes to, how they are with other people. Ray is an extreme extrovert and Morgan's a super introvert. And so with Ray, there were a lot of things with social learning. It was like I thought I had to put him in social situations for him to learn these skills, when really he needed to be home. He needed to be in a lot smaller, easier social situations so that he could grow up a little bit, and so that he could learn what were for him easier skills first. Without realizing it, I was kind of throwing him into the shark tank and going, okay, kid. Today you're sharks. What you like, right? You're social.
Yeah.
And, and so really from him, I learned the value of, so it's okay to keep things small. And then Morgan, was just not a people person. And it's really amazing to watch how she approaches learning about other people. And this is the part where I really got to learn a lot about myself, because I'm also an introvert, not as strong as she is. But, so I did a lot of like alternative education research onto how do you, there's a lot of this in Montessori classrooms actually, about how do you incorporate a kid who's not a people person. And it was there that I learned that, some kids just need to stand back and watch. Some kids can't do the whole group at once. They need to see how people act and react and then make up their minds about that. They need to see how the whole group works and then how smaller groups work and figure out the details. And learning about that, I was like, oh, wow, really? That's allowed? I can do that.
Yeah, that's okay.
All right.
We learn so much about ourselves, don't we, when we watch our kids in action?
I mean, there's like even like this week, somebody at work like said something. I don't even remember what, and I was like, oh, wow, is that how you handle that kind of situation? I make mental notes.
It's funny. I shared a quick story on last week's podcast episode where I talked about Michael's starting karate, because he did that. He was very much like, wanting to understand a situation before jumping in too much, because he started, you sign up, you pay for your month, and you can go as often as you want, but he only wanted to go once a week. Right. And he wanted to check it out on his own. He didn't want me, because I think he was 8 or 9 at the time. So this was a piece of him stepping out, but he knew. He's like, no, just one class a week, thanks. He knew that about himself. And then once he saw how everything worked, got a bit of a feel for the people, for sensei, all that kind of stuff. And he's like, okay, 2 or 3 months later, it's like, okay, now let's look for a second class, and then he just added and added and added at his own pace. And that was so interesting for me to watch and to think through, because at first you're like, I signed you up. You got to, we'll get our money's worth. You love karate. You wanted to sign up. Why don't you want to go, 3 or 4 times a week, right? But to be able to, take that pause and say, hey, this isn't a race. This is him figuring some stuff out. And not only it wasn't just about figuring out karate, right? There was just so much learning going on in there for those, 2-3 months and continuing, but so much about himself learning, figuring out the situation on his own, seeing where he was comfortable, just so much. It was crazy.
Yeah. And that's right there, another one of the big advantages about stepping outside of the classroom model is that there's so much learning that all just gets wound in together. Like you said, he wasn't just there learning about karate. Mm-hmm. He was learning a lot of other things at the same time, and school tries to minimize that. You are not here to socialize, young lady.
Mm-hmm.
You're working on math now. Put your science book away. I got sent to the principal's office for reading my science book during math.
Yeah.
Well, I've done all the math problems,
Well, now I'm going to tie this back into this comparison, right? We're talking about compulsory school years because, so say, I've got 12 years or whatever it is in your state, whatever, and I have this set of curriculum, so I have to break it out over this number of years, and this is it. But what I found by watching, my kids and other unschooling kids is you realize that you don't ever just learn one thing at a time, right? your math might lead you to some reading, which might lead you to some history, which might lead you to a map, on and on and on. And I think that because school has to so carefully, slice up the learning, all those interconnections between everything never come to the surface, right? So the world's greatest student coming out still has all that learning in discrete packages and doesn't see how it all relates.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, actually, my daughter and I were just talking about this last night. We were watching some TV show where there was an anthropologist having an argument with a psychologist, and they were both speaking, they're both saying the same things, but basically speaking different languages. And then, like, the extreme, at the extreme ends of academia, that's what's separating all of these disciplines as rigorously as we do, that's what it results in. Because, the idea that sociology and psychology, or psychology and anthropology, or sociology and anthropology, those are all different things. On one level, that's a little crazy. Mm-hmm. About people and how people get along with each other. And yeah.
That's very cool.
Yeah. And so, so we got to talk about that while watching TV and, talk about whether we like burritos or popcorn. So we got to learn a whole lot of things at once.
Oh, yeah, no, that's fascinating. I love that. All right, comparison number 4, school's focus on the child adapting to the classroom environment and unschooling's focus on the child's personal learning style. So what are some of the advantages that you see for children who are learning outside of the classroom? Because that's not big.
Right.
I'm just setting you up here.
Well, obviously, it's a much richer experience. And that's something that goes all the way back to good old Socrates again, wandering around town instead of sitting in a classroom. There's a bigger world out there. And even though putting kids in a classroom can feel safe on a parental level, we know it's not a great environment. We know that trying to get kids to adapt to that environment doesn't work very well. That's really the whole driving force behind all kinds of alternative education and even conventional education reform, right? We know the classroom isn't a great place. That's why there's field trips. That's why you have break days where you watch movies. One of the real tragedies of the push to get kids in school sooner and to standard education more is that culturally we've lost our love of. You remember Tom Sawyer? Tom Sawyer was this kid cult hero when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of glamorized. He was the kid who didn't fit in well in the classroom. He was always kind of in trouble. but he was a hero for not fitting in. Or Pippi Longstocking. She was a hero for not fitting in. And those aren't really like the models we think of when we think of kids in education today. Today those kids, they get diagnosed and medicated.
Yep.
The one kid hero is, Harry Potter, who lasts 6 years in a boarding school. Right? And he doesn't really leave for school reasons. He, leaves because the world's going to end or something. My daughter's kind of atypical. I don't usually make a big deal about it, but I'm going to mention it. And it's one of the reasons I'm really, really glad she never had to adapt to the classroom environment, because I think it would have been a nightmare for her. She didn't even like the few classes that she tried here and there. And she's really sensitive to a lot of the things she'd run into in school. She doesn't like crowds of people. There's certain kinds of sounds, sounds in the vocal range that she doesn't really like. She doesn't do well with certain kinds of attention. And it's the sort of thing where when she has a lot of control over her choices and the way she gets to interact with people, it's much less of an issue than when she, just doesn't have any choice in the matter. And I think if she was in school, unless she managed to get a run of really, really sympathetic teachers, she would have shut down pretty hard. And might not even be all that high functioning at this point. And instead, I think she's my super introvert. And she has some quirks and she has some sensitivities, but none of these are really defects. They're not necessarily things that stop her. It's kind of like, to use a different kid example from culture, like Wednesday Addams. Morgan's more like the Wednesday Addams kid. She's kind of weird. She's from kind of a weird family, but it's not a bad thing. It's not something she sees as a bad thing. She knows she's not like the other kids in town because she's met them. And they're not there.
Well, and that's one thing I love too. I mean, it was Joseph not fitting in, into the typical classroom environment that got me looking and finding homeschooling and unschooling. But the point is, number one, like you said, it's not, once they're out of the classroom, it's not a big deal per se. It's who they are. And the point is, they're learning, they're learning so much about themselves when they don't have that expectation layer on top of them, right? They're learning who they really, really are. And they're learning the kinds of tools and, just tools and ways that they can work through, whether it's a quirk here or a need here. They're just figuring out ways that they can accommodate that during the day, and ways that can, when they want to do something that maybe makes them a bit more uncomfortable, knowing all the things that they can do to support themselves. This is all learning they're not going to have in the classroom, because in the classroom, they're just like, you do this and that's it, or you get in trouble, right?
Right. Yeah. It's really constrained. And in the world, my super introverted kid, I have seen her walk up to a complete stranger at a party with, chaos and noise and all the things she hates, walk up to a complete stranger and make a friend. Just, and, and this was a friend, this was an adult actually who was playing Pokemon. And this is my Pokemon saves the world story. This guy played Pokemon, and sits down next to him and starts talking to him about Pokemon. And for several years they had a weekly Pokemon get together. They, he'd come over and they'd play Pokemon. And I was there in the background. It wasn't like they were left alone or anything. But that was her Pokemon buddy. And she did that in a party of all places. I wouldn't have expected that. She knows enough about, she's been able to learn enough about other people and what to look for in other people, that she knows when there's somebody she can connect to. And in school, she'd just be a maladapted kid.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be it. And she'd know that, she didn't fit.
Yeah. And because the classroom environment is such a particular environment, there are so many kids. I mean, I'm not going to regurgitate our whole learning to read episode, but that was one of the points. In school, you understand why it is important in the system, to have a kind of learning style that, reads early, takes information in through reading, spits it out through writing, for tests and that kind of stuff. That style is going to do well there. But the problem is every other style, makes the kid feel stupid, not able to work inside that environment. So they think there's something wrong with them, rather than, oh, gee, this just isn't a great setup and great environment for you.
Yeah, and in school, Morgan would have to do things like she would have to look her teachers in the face, and
Mm-hmm.
And she would have to respond when they asked her questions in a certain tone of voice, and these are things that in the adult world, adults don't speak to each other like that. Adults don't expect even the same kind of face-to-face contact as we expect from kids. And she can deal with an adult-to-adult relationship. No, she could deal with a kid-to-kid, but the teacher-child sort of relationship, no, that hits all her. I'm uncomfortable with this button.
That's a really great point, because that really is more of a kind of a power submission kind of relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's very it's very stylized for that environment. No.
Yeah.
Teachers are expected to teach and to speak in kind of particular tones of voice. They use a particular kind of body language, and yeah, those are all the things that really shut Morgan down in big ways. I'm talking about curl up under the chair, shut down. I mean,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah. And out in the world, I could put myself between Morgan and an adult and say, I think she needs a little space right now. And, and people didn't always like that, but it gave her the chance to figure out what her boundaries are and decide when she wanted to move beyond them. A couple of years ago, 2 summers ago now, we were out on the East Coast visiting relatives, and we were at the zoo, and we forgot to bring any water. Morgan got dehydrated and passed out. And apparently this is really common at the zoo. The EMTs were like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. We just need to get her hydrated. Right. So,
mm-hmm.
and she perked up, but she had to deal with complete strangers. She had to deal with EMTs. They weren't able to find a vein. So we ended up having to go to the hospital. So she had to deal with a lot of complete strangers in situations that could have really shut her down hard, and didn't. She was like, okay. I said, all right, Morgan, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. And she looked at me. She was like, okay, I got this, and she did. She was able to answer questions and give medical information to people she'd never met in her life, and even deal with the obnoxious voice people use when they speak to children sometimes.
Yeah.
She was just dealt. It's just like, okay, I got this. And those are all the things that aren't supposed to happen unless you put kids in very structured environments and make them deal. They actually can learn to deal in the real world on their own terms. That's
fascinating, because it made me think back to when Michael was in the hospital for a few days when he was first diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and dealing with all the medical staff and and it made me smile when you talked about that voice when they're talking to kids. I think he was 9 or something, or 11. Anyway, yeah. And me, when they would come in and start talking to me and asking me questions, and I would redirect them to him. But that's the whole point, how many times we help them through situations when they're younger because, they aren't comfortable, right? But they see us do it and happily help them out time and again and time and again and time and again. And, there does come a point where they just step up for themselves, right? They're not looking, that corner of your eye or that little special signal or something that says, or just, shutting down and not answering that says, hey, come on and help me through this moment. And they just pick it up and deal with it. It's so interesting. That's a cool story for her.
Yeah.
I'm sure it wasn't so fun at the moment. It's always nicer looking back on them, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, at the time it was really stressful. In retrospect, now it's one of those like, yay, team unschooling moments. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It does work.
I know. That was exactly the situation at the time, too.
It's like, look, she's talking to complete strangers and dealing with a foreign bureaucracy. Look! You didn't have to go to school to learn that.
Okay, we should probably move on to our last comparison, number 5. Schools focus on testing and unschooling's focus on being with the child. So a common question from people trying to wrap their mind around unschooling is, if we aren't testing them, how do we know that they're learning?
Testing is going to be one of the worst ways to evaluate what someone actually knows. Even educators know that. I mean, it's one of the things they complain about. It's one of the things, parents complain about. It's one of the things teachers complain about. Colleges complain about. I took a testing methods class, and one of the focuses on it was like, what are the things these tests don't do? And that's the big thing with a lot of tests. They always, by definition, have a very narrow scope of what they're measuring. And I think testing is one of those things people do to feel safe. You can point to a test score and say, see, we're not just screwing around here. Education is happening. Everything's coming down. Everything's fine. It's, I don't live in a state where you have to test. And so that's sometimes, a question I get. I was like, oh, don't you have to test them? How do you know what they're doing? And it's funny because every time a teacher asks me that, I say, well, what do your kids know a week after the test? And they always stop and go, oh, yeah, fair point. Got me there.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah. And that's what makes, the kind of experiential learning that is a lot of unschooling. That's what makes it harder to evaluate, because there aren't a lot of easy, simple things that you can point at as proof that learning is happening. And it's, it's arguably one of the downsides of unschooling, at least in the short term. From one day to the next or 1 week to the next, there's not a lot of concrete evidence. In the longer term, there's a lot of concrete evidence. And you find out really just by living with your kids and having conversations, doing things together, telling jokes. There's a page or comment on Sandra Dodd's website that it says something about being able to get more jokes. This is one of the good things about natural learning, is your kids get more jokes. And humor is really a fantastic way to know what somebody else knows and how they understand the world. When somebody's not getting a joke, there's a hole in their learning there. Or there's certain kinds of jokes people make that the jokes themselves show that they don't understand something. And as a parent, you probably remember times when your kid was finally old enough to get a certain kind of joke, like when they were finally old enough to get irony. I like irony, and I had to learn not to use irony when Ray was little.
Yeah.
It's people took me aside and says, little kids don't really get irony. Ooh. All right.
Good point.
And that tells you something about their kid, but they finally like make an ironic comment. Like, ooh, we reached the stage of irony. Good, check.
A door has opened.
Planner there. Puns. You learn a lot about what kids know by what kind of associations they make. And puns, my partner is a very high-level punster. And Ray somehow didn't get this gene. He's like an average punster. So, it was interesting watching him like trying to figure out what puns were and how to make them. Morgan is definitely an expert level punster, even though she's not much of a talker. She really has a good grasp of how language works, and it really comes out in the kind of jokes she makes, because a lot of them are about the connections between words and among ideas, and puns are part of that. And sexual humor. She's finally reached the sexual humor stage, which is just really interesting. Like the potty humor stage, wasn't enough. Yeah. Now we've reached sexual humor. 14, they all get there somehow, I guess. And yet at the same time, it's like that, it's one of the things I'm worried about, especially with a kid I can't like sit down and talk to. How is she going to learn about, sex and stuff? So when she starts, making sex jokes, it's like, oh, where'd you learn that? Especially with older kids, I think unschooling is full of a lot of where did you learn that moments.
I know, that's so fun. That's the whole point, right? When you're with them and hanging around with them and making jokes and having conversations, you can almost see their mind at work, and you see all these new pieces of information, and you're like, hey, yeah, exactly. Where did they pick that up? Or how did they make that connection? Or,
it's, oh my gosh, were you actually listening when I was having that conversation?
Yeah, that too.
Wait, you were watching Game of Thrones? Oh, I thought you were playing a video game in the other room.
But yeah, I mean, just hanging out with them. But as you said, maybe not over, a week or two. We're talking, a few months, and a few months, you see these natural like progressions and steps when you're looking at looking back a bit of, a few month period, right? A bigger time period.
Yeah. And sometimes it does happen fast. I mean, sometimes kids will grab something and then just pull it in like really fast. You can even see them working on it. Morgan's one of those kids where every now and then she'll get something and you can just really see her working on it.
I love that. Okay, next question. While conventional wisdom tells us that children resist learning and need to be motivated to do it, unschooling parents see something very different. So why don't unschooled kids hate learning?
I think curiosity is one of the driving forces of human nature. And I think people sometimes miss that. I mean, we know that sort of generally, but we tend to, say this person isn't curious or that person isn't curious. Because we have a certain amount of intellectual snobbery about, what kind of learning is worthy and what's not. Mm-hmm. And so, like a good example is really anything to do with pop culture. There's sort of an attitude that like, oh, that's not real. It's not even something we think about as learning. Learning. I don't even mean just like learning song lyrics, but finding out like which supermodel is sleeping with which rock star. We don't think about that as learning, but that's part of the process of human curiosity to dive into even just details like that and learn about the world. One of the great strengths of unschooling is it doesn't divide up those kinds of learning. It doesn't say this kind of learning is superior to that kind of learning. It's okay when kids want to learn all the evolutions of all the Pokemon. Or learn the names of all the characters in Barbie Fairytopia and what all their special gifts are. And there's a lot of pressure on parents to steer kids away from certain interests. No. And I mean, the obvious ones are things like, like violence and sex, but we really try to steer them away from pop culture in a lot of ways because we don't value that kind of learning. And that steering is what leads kids to find learning frustrating. They get told that the things they want to learn aren't worth learning. And it was like, well, what's the point of learning at all then? I mean, if I can't learn about Pokemon, what's the point? And
I don't even. Oh, go ahead.
No, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say, you know what, when I think back, I'm trying to think if my kids, once they were home, if they even really, used the word learning. I want to learn. They were just like doing. They were just following their curiosity and doing it. I think part of it was that learning just became so much a part of life. It was just like living. So, they wouldn't dislike getting up and living.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They were accomplishing their own goals, whatever it is that they wanted, and they didn't say my goal today is, well, sometimes they did, but, it was just following their curiosity and finding what they wanted to accomplish and do. And they just, in doing that, they learned a whole bunch of stuff, but it was just the living in the moment of that day. They didn't say, okay, I need to learn this and this and this. They just kind of did it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was one of the really awesome things about finally getting to pull Ray out of school was getting to see his love of learning come back. Mm-hmm. And because by the time he left school, he's like, learning is stupid. I hate learning. But, it was, maybe 2 weeks of being home. And we went and got some spray paint. He wanted to learn about spray painting skulls onto skateboards. And because he was still in school, he was still thinking in terms of learning. So it was just like, I want to learn to do, spray painting. Like, okay, all right, we'll do this. And because that was okay, that one little thing spread out in so many different directions. It was just amazing. I mean, just the simple act of buying a can of spray paint ended up involving learning about the legal system, because it turns out that spray paint is a controlled substance when you're a teenager.
No.
His parents had to come and buy him some spray paint, and then you had to get rid of it. No, it's fine. It's okay. You don't need to call child services. We're on this. He's going to legitimately use it to, that is, he's going to use it on an art project. Yes, we're homeschoolers. We have an art project. Shh, don't say anything. Don't say anything about skateboards or skulls. So I mean, one little trip to buy a can of spray paint, and really you learn more about laws and the justice system than all his previous education combined. Mm-hmm. And it was fun, and it was interesting, and he got what he wanted. He didn't get in trouble. There was a moment of like, oh, this is getting weird. It's like, oh no, wait, parents are here to the rescue. Whoa, we get to be here to the rescue. Instead of the disciplinarians for a change. I'm
going to switch. Yeah, go.
And a lot of times, parents are like, how do I make learning interesting? I'm worried about that when I was homeschooling. How do you make learning interesting and fun? It turns out that learning is already interesting and fun. It's kind of wired into our heads that way. And when we don't prioritize, giving quizzes on Article 3 of the Constitution over buying spray paint, learning stays fun and interesting.
I love that point, because that's, because the challenges with school is because they don't have a choice in what they're learning. Learning really is hard at school because they're not interested, right? It makes no connection to them. It's not something in their everyday lives that's useful. So when you're not interested and you're not engaged with it, learning really is hard. And then that's what they internalize, Right. I hate learning. Learning's hard. It's just, memorizing, and then they take that an understanding, a perspective that they take with them for the rest of their life, right?
Yeah, and and education also makes learning hard. Some of it is because you're trying to get, 30 kids on the same page at the same time, and get them all through this generalized body of knowledge at the same rate. But some of it is this again goes back to the whole system of education on a cultural level. Is there's an old idea that learning should be hard. If it's not hard, it's not learning. And I mean, really, this goes back to when everyone couldn't learn to read because a lot of things weren't written down. Now you had to go to certain places and have a certain background to be able to learn to read. Because the books just weren't available; they were all handwritten. So, but even at that time, it's really interesting. I was reading something about the history of writing, and at one point in, I think it was the 8th century, there became this new fad starting in the Irish monasteries to put spaces between words. I mean, we think of that as a normal thing, but someone had to invent this. And one of the complaints that people had about it was that it made learning to read too easy.
I heard that same thing a few days ago, and I swear it must have been an audiobook I was listening to, but maybe, I don't know, how did we both come across that same thing recently? Like there was no paragraphs, there was no spaces, it was just like all written in a row, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That's another separation kind of technique, that you must want this, it must be hard, or it's not worth it, and that kind of stuff. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, one of the challenges that newer unschooling parents sometimes encounter is interpreting the actions of experienced unschoolers as a set of rules for unschooling. But unschooling doesn't really have a recipe, does it?
I think one of the reasons parents actually come in looking for rules and recipes is because parenting tends to be framed that way in general already. It's like, okay, I'm stepping away from the usual parenting rules. So what are the new rules?
What are the new ones?
What are the new ones? And it's for all the same reasons. You want to stay safe, and following the recipe keeps you safe, even if the results don't taste very good. No, it's okay. Follow the recipe. It is safe. And I think, in a way, unschooling could be said to have a recipe, or to use a recipe as a jumping off point, but it's not a recipe about unschooling. It's like a recipe about human nature, about people and relationships. And part of that recipe is knowing that people are curious and like to learn. And part of the recipe is knowing that people are social and we care about other people and we like to learn from other people. And part of the recipe is knowing there's a difference between the external world and the world of individual experience, or a difference between the self and the other. It's a complicated recipe. I mean, human nature is not, a simple, straightforward thing. And unschooling jumps off from there. It's like, okay, this is what we know about being people. And
yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And that's, when you think about it in that perspective as a recipe, those are really kind of like the principles of unschooling, right? So that's kind of it's a recipe for understanding versus a recipe of the actions. It's the actions that come out of that understanding. Right?
Yeah. And that kind of way of thinking about people and learning in particular is something that's been talked and written about for centuries as it pertains to adults. What's new and different about unschooling in this day and age is that we're finally bringing kids into the picture. And so sometimes people say things like, unschooling is about treating kids like adults. Somebody asked me this the other way. It's like, oh, so this unschooling thing is about treating kids like adults. Well, you don't want them to, pay rent, and you don't let them have the keys to the car right away. But it does mean bringing that same kind of understanding we have towards other adults into our relationship with our kids. I mean, they're not the same as we are, but the fact that there's a difference between, the world as it is and the world as it's perceived still matters, whether you're a kid or an adult. There's still that. They're not the same as we are, but they're still social. They're not the same as we are, but then neither is anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
We can apply all those things that we know about being people to our kids. And one of the startling things about learning about unschooling is realizing the extent that we don't do that. And I know it's something, it's hard to bring it up in like one-on-one conversation because nobody wants to admit that we don't think of our kids as people in the same way adults are. I mean, that's just so offensive to all our sensibilities. And yet when we start like making that shift and saying, oh, wait a minute, kids can do that too.
Yeah, I think that's such a huge, huge point, Meredith. It's not about treating the kids as adults. It's about treating them as people, like real people.
Right.
And what a huge perspective shift, isn't it? When you all of a sudden see, and you start to see how truly capable they are as a person at that age that they are.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not like a 5-year-old person, is going to want to do things, or find themselves in situations that, a 15-year-old person would, because I think that's a lot of what our stress and worry comes from, because we project today into the future and imagine it, right? Yeah. Oh, but, because drugs comes up or something, but your kid's 5. Right. They're going to be a different person when they're 15.
If I shoes with the little lights out of me, want to use heroin. Wait a minute. Let's not want to do heroin. Back up. We're talking about shoes.
Back up. That person has a lot of, development that they're going to do between 5 and 15. It's not going to be the same conversation. But yeah, I mean, that's key. I love that. Seeing them as people, and that's a huge paradigm shift, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Something I'd like to talk about for a moment is choice, because I think one of the key aspects, principles, roots of unschooling is giving our children the space and the support to make the choices that they think will work for them. What's your perspective on the importance of choice?
We'll talk about that a little bit in relationship to why unschooling kids don't hate learning. Choices there. But I kind of want to go in a different direction, because one of the really interesting things about people getting to make choices is that there's more of a chance to make mistakes. And that's really important for learning. A lot of learning comes out of the kinds of mistakes you make. It's also one of the things that really scares the pants off of parents. We really, really don't want our kids to make mistakes, especially not some of the mistakes that we made.
I know.
We'd rather just give them the answers to those life questions. So they don't have to go through that process. Yeah, there are things you just take my word on it, kid. Yeah, really. We're very altruistic in that way. And unfortunately, our kids don't want that. They don't want our pre-lived experiences handed to them. They want their own experience. They want their own process. They want their own little rabbit trails of curiosity, even knowing that some of those rabbit trails are going to dump them in a pool of tears, or land them in the court of the Red Queen. There's scary things down some of those trails, and kids can be surprisingly okay with that. And it's one of the really interesting things about learning is how much the ability to make those mistakes, the ability to even choose to make a mistake that's kind of painful is an important part of the process, and can be a really powerful part of the process. which isn't to say you should set kids up to fail.
Yeah.
And that's really another part of the choice issue as it pertains to learning. There's a difference between choosing to take a risk and having it dumped on you, right? There's an actual difference in what you learn from that experience. And
yeah, big time, right?
We get stuck on this. We were talking earlier about, like, kids in social situations, and you probably know, like I do, how much encouragement you get to push your kids to do certain things, move out of their comfort zone, and there's a degree to which we want to do that because we want our kids to know how awesome they are. We want them to know just how much they can do and be in the world. And one of the things that confuses that issue is that, people have all these stories about how they were pushed and that really worked. But what ends up working has to do with that difference between, like, the world out there and the world inside the self, which is where when kids feel like they're getting to choose and they feel like we're helping them to choose, then they can feel empowered. If pushing and encouraging to them feels like we're helping them choose, that feels really great. When they feel like they're being thrown into the shark tank, not so much. And that's something that comes up with atypical kids a lot, how much to let them choose to move out of their comfort zone. As if their own feelings about choice were something we could let them have. It's ultimately, that those are their feelings and it's their choice, and they're going to make their own choices based on their own internal accounting. We don't get to pick that. We don't get to say, now you can decide to be brave, my child. They're going to be their own people, no matter what. What we can do what we can do is we can listen to our kids about what choices are important to them right now and how they want us to help them. And they don't always know that, but that's okay too. It's okay to be learning alongside your kids and figuring things out together. And that was one of the really good things I've learned along the way. Unschooling was, sometimes it was okay to say to my kids, okay, parenting fail here. I don't know what I'm doing. You have any ideas? Okay, neither do I. We're going to blunder our way through this one and see what happens on the other end. And that kind of, and in conventional parenting, no, you don't do that. You have to be the parent. But learning alongside somebody is something that kids really seem to get on like a deep under the skin level. They want security. They want to know that, somebody's keeping the lights on, but they also, like, understand on a gut level that people are social. And so learning together makes sense to them.
Yeah. Right now, Michael started a new job a couple of weeks ago, and it's totally new. Right. And we've been having those conversations as in, neither of us kind of know the right path forward, what's going to help, between his diabetes management, because it's a very active physical job and a show, and, the hours and the drive. There's just so many variables that are up in the air, and we're just like brainstorming together. It's not like, well, I don't come up and say, well, I'm the parent. I have experience in this area. I think you should leave this time. You should be taking this food. You should be checking your blood sugar here, blah, 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 blah. No, it's a total, oh man, look at this, all this stuff we have to consider. And it's us coming up with a plan, And when you were talking about before about not, telling them what to do, that they're going to make their own choices. But that's the whole point, is they're not making those choices in a vacuum, right? We're not telling them what to do, but we're like sharing what we see. We're sharing any experience that we have if they're interested in it. But because we have an open and trusting relationship at that point, when these bigger things come up, we have that open communication. So, we can share bits of information that we have, and we aren't insulted if they, make a different choice, right?
Right.
Because we know we've given them more fodder in which they can make that choice.
Yeah.
Rather than demanding them make a certain choice that matches up. And I loved your point about making mistakes being a big point of learning. I remember years ago, I think it was Kelly Lovejoy. She used to call them learning takes instead of mistakes, because you learn so much. Like, things that went wrong in quotes, I mean, I really don't see as mistakes, because we learn so much. Remember, we were talking about way back in the karate story that you're learning so much in the situation, not even just about that one particular yes, no choice or whatever it is you do. We even learn so much when we choose not to do things.
Yeah.
And, when we step back and say, oh, I didn't go to that, you're still learning, do you regret it later? Blah, blah, blah. All this kind of stuff. You're learning in every moment.
Well, it was like Morgan passing out at the zoo. I mean, that could be seen as a pretty dramatic parenting fail. We failed to keep the child hydrated. Child hit the dirt. but
you learned, right?
You learned a whole heck of a lot from it.
Exactly.
I think things we really wouldn't have expected to learn. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's like, well, that happened. Crap. I'm going to, pay extra attention moving forward. But yeah, you can't.
And this is an idea that I'm really familiar with as a professional craftsperson, because, so many times when I'm in situations where it's like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. How much fabric do I have left? Oh, not really enough. Okay, time to get creative and learn a new skill. and so, I'm very familiar with, how even, sometimes catastrophic mistakes can, be okay in retrospect once you've learned that thing. And yeah, I mean, we don't want our kids to learn too many things the hard way. And the goal is not to, say, all right, you are learning at the school of life.
Yeah. Because there's so much that we can, so that's why we talk so much about supporting them, right? Not just leaving them on their own, because, we can help them so much. But there are moments that, despite all the help that we can think of and the things that we do, life's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But we don't need to set them up for it. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our last question for today. One theme that has come up pretty regularly on the podcast is that in the end, unschooling thrives when we have, like we've just been talking about, strong, connected, and trusting relationships with our children. You recently wrote something that I really loved. You wrote, it may help to step back from the idea that parenting is a job. It's a relationship first and foremost. So I was hoping you could expand on that a bit for us.
Yeah, it's funny because that's something that gets said a lot about how parenting is a job, and it's only really recently that I thought, that's not a very good metaphor. Because the idea that parenting is a job kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that parenting is about teaching. It's our job to teach our kids what's right in the world. And those are the ideas that distract us from our kids', personhood, I guess you could say. Unschooling reconceptualizes the whole parent-child relationship as a relationship first and foremost. And that changes so many things. I mean, imagine just for a second if you were to describe having a baby in terms of getting a new best friend as opposed to starting a new job. How does that change your whole attitude about this other person? And naturally, you want to do right by your new best friend. Right? You want to be a good friend. You want this friendship to be a strong and healthy one that you can value your whole life long, even knowing that people grow and change and that different people bring different things to relationships, right? That all feels really, really different than trying to figure out how many diaper changes until your new employee will be ready to take out the trash without supervision.
Oh, I love that.
And the great thing is that it works. It doesn't somehow ruin kids to be a really good friend to them. it doesn't, unfit them for life or any of the other things they warn you about in the parenting job training handbooks. It's actually okay to be friends with your kid, and it feels so much better than parenting as a job. I have a full-time job. I get to go home to my kid and be a friend, and that's awesome.
That's really I think that's one of the huge shifts when people, get through deschooling and to unschooling, that it's just life now. It's not like parent-child, it's a family living together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, having lived that other life, it's a really different feel.
Mm-hmm. It's like night and day.
Yeah.
That's why you have, experienced unschoolers online excitedly sharing.
Really, you can like your kids even as teenagers. I swear it can happen.
I know, and you can have a good relationship and you can have fun with them and you can enjoy things together. It's why I think it seems maybe so utopian or just downright crazy to, conventional people. And, and that's not a negative thing to say, with school or convention, because you see that you understand their perspective, because the environment in which they've set up and that they're living, those are the things that are going to happen. Kids are going to hate learning. Parents are going to think they need to control. Yeah. But, when you take that leap, it's a whole different life, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, even when Ray was in school, knowing that because we didn't really have any other good alternatives at that point, we had to deprioritize relationships in a lot of ways. There were things that had to happen so that school could happen.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those things get in the way of relationships, and that's just how it works. I mean, school is not about building relationships, not between parents and kids, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's not, like you said, it's not necessarily like dissing school. In some ways it is, but it's not really dissing school to say that, unschooling is more about relationships. Because there's a lot of things that, in terms of relationships, that really can't happen in the same ways when kids are in school, especially if they're by choice. I mean, that's another big issue is how much choice plays a part. In being able to have a relationship.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, because even the experience of school is fundamentally different if the child is choosing to go, right?
Yeah.
Because they still feel empowered. They still, have that possibility.
Yeah.
The possibility to say, no more, thanks. And then because I know I was talking to Carlo Ricci a while ago on the podcast, and he talks to his daughters who've chosen to go to school, all the time about the things that they, put up with, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, because what they get out of it is more. So they talk about, the stuff they don't like, the more negative things, but because they know it's a choice, right. They know that they're making that choice. They know that they're not being forced to put up with that stuff. Right. So they don't internalize it as much, right?
Yeah.
No. Okay, well, I must say I had a great time speaking with you, Meredith. Thanks so much.
You asked me to do this.
I hope you had fun too. And before we go, where's the best place for people to connect with you online?
Best place is probably Unschooling Mom to Mom on Facebook. I'm there every day.
Yes, I love going by to check out what you're writing. That's where I found the quote, I believe.
Yes, I think that's pretty much the only place I write about unschooling these days. So.
Okay, well, I will be sure to share a link in the show notes for everyone. If they aren't already a member, they can go check it out. It's a great group. And thanks very much. Have a great evening now, Meredith.
Yes, it's evening here too.
Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You might also like the backlist episodes at livingjoyfully.ca/podcast. You can also get your free Exploring Unschooling ebook at livingjoyfully.ca/exploring unschooling. If you'd like to connect, you can also find me on Facebook at Living Joyfully. Until next time, have fun living and learning with your family.